Hey, and welcome to week 6, reading and writing as part of science. Um, this week we're going to pause in the book and do some readings outside of the text as we think about how reading and writing are part of science. Then next week we'll move on to constructivism in chapter 4. The reason I wanted to pause here is because I feel that reading and writing weren't given enough coverage in the process section of your book. And given what we learned in week 2 about the inclusion of reading and writing in the content areas in the Common Core standards, I want to talk a bit about how reading and writing actually function as a process within science, separate from the Common Core, and then we can tie that back into our discussion of the Common Core from week 2. Quick guide to this week. This week has 4 sections, each of which has its own readings, videos, and activities. They don't all have all of those things. The 4 sections are what is text, literacy in science, how do scientists use text, and student-generated text. I'll review the assignment for each section as we get to it, and I actually recommend you go through the resources as topics, not all the readings, then all the videos. It'll help it to make more sense to you to keep things grouped together into those 4 distinct topics. Our first section is what is text, and we need to establish a baseline definition of this. It's really important because just like we discussed last week when we talked about operational definitions, we need to be really clear that we mean the same thing when we use these terms. Your reading for this section is Comprehension, Strategy, and Instruction for Multimodal Texts in Science, which is a really big title, and the link here is provided that you can go and download the PDF. The video that you'll watch is What is Text, and this is a really, really short video. And it'll help expand our definition of text. And there's not any activity for this section. And I just quickly want to say this reading, what I really appreciate about this reading is that it's forced me to expand my definition of text in terms of where we get the information we use to understand science. It looks at a specific classroom, a specific activity, and where it is that the students are getting their information and kind of by definition then what the texts are that they're using. So let's think about reconceptualizing text. I think that we all would think of a book as a text. We probably would identify that formulas and mathematical equations are text. We'd probably think of the internet as text. We're going to kind of expand maybe for some of us to include symbols as text. When I look at that symbol right there, I get a whole lot of information. If that's posted on the side of a container, if it's posted on a product that I've purchased at the store, that tells me something really distinct. That image has become a piece of text. I definitely can say that written kind of models, whether they're drawings and have pictures or they have words on them, are also text. And in fact, in the video, you'll see that they define some multimedia and kind of things that don't necessarily have a ton of written words on them also as text. So as I mentioned, the purpose of that video is to help you expand your definition and reconceptualize how we use text and to have a kind of shared definition of that. And if we think about those traditional ideas of text in the science classroom, textbooks, the writing of other scientists, books like you see in the screen, informational text, lab reports, procedures written for labs, even formulas and instructions on how to calculate things. We're going to call those things traditional written text. When you watch the video, though, I really want you to think about how your personal definition of text got expanded. It'll really help you to answer the forum questions for this week. So some key points that I want you to take away from the article by Alverman and Wilson. And, you're going to need to read the article to really understand what these points mean, but these are some things as you read that. It's a pretty dense article, some things to kind of look for. So the first is this idea of multiple sign systems. Some of the sign systems or semiotic resources, symbolic systems, they use some different terms for them. Things like when I'm using a model and I'm getting information from that, that's one system. If I'm looking at a photograph, I'm looking at another system. When I'm hearing my teacher talk, I'm getting another system. When I have written language, I'm getting another system. All of these have kind of have their own way of being interpreted and being used, and that gives them all different affordances, different potential uses. If I have to describe to you what a sunset looks like and I have to do that with just written text, there's a lot of different strengths than if I'm able to use a picture with that text. Okay, so this this idea of multiple sign systems becomes really important in this article and really important in the way they think about how we're going to take in information about science. The next one is translation of content from one sign system to another. So when I have my students going to do a lab, they're taking in information one way, they're putting it back out to me another way. Kind of what is the impact of that? So especially when we think about really little kids and how hard it is for them to take the information that they've taken in kind of visually through a pictorial sign system and put it out into a word sign system, that's a real challenge that kids have. And that becomes really important in science, where we are constantly asking our students to transition back and forth between different systems. They talk a lot about this idea of critical approach and asking students to really think about the ways in which they can present and take in information and what the audience is about. Thinking about the affordances and constraints, or the benefits and drawbacks of each of the different modes that we have. And then this idea of metacognition, making sure students are able to monitor their own thinking process, monitor how they approach a different text, thinking about how maybe it's okay for me to be in and this is me, not the text, but thinking about how, if as I'm taking in written words, I really need to think some different things about my environment, and maybe I'm not going to understand that if you're talking to me while I try to read, but maybe there are other types of text that interacting with them while I'm having a verbal conversation is okay. So kind of understanding and regulating my own process of how I approach different types of text, that becomes an important thing. And there's this great quote in that text that says, comprehension strategy instruction should address systematic and explicit ways for supporting students as they construct meaning across these texts. So again, in the Common Core, as you created those naming the standards activities, each of you at your grade level would have named a standard that said something about integrating representations. Kind of, we have different types of texts and bringing them together. And in science, that's such a natural process of science, the bringing together of multiple representations of the same thing. That this article, I think, really helps us to think about that. The forum post questions for this section, you'll talk first about how does traditional written language interact with other types of text, like the physical world, in your classroom. So when you think about planning for instruction, what do you need to think about for that interaction in science between written language and the physical world? And then the second one, what types of texts are most vital for you personally when you make meaning in science? So as you reflect on all of the reading and the information, and you reflect on making meaning in science over the years and your own education, what was it that helped you most? And I think that reflecting on that now, as you think about going out into the classroom, will help you to plan instruction that's really meaningful for your students. This next section is literacy in science. Here we're going to start by defining what we mean by literacy in science, and then talking a little bit about what it means to support literacy in a science classroom. So you have two readings this time, and one of them I've provided two links. The clean version, you have to register to access it, or there's a free, there's a way you can link it, get to it without registering for the science magazine that it came out of, which that registration is free, but kind of a pain for depending on your system. So there's a highlighted version. So it's a little bit marked up. You'll have to ignore the highlights, but it's the same thing just with highlighting. And then a second one. So that first one is literacy and science, each in the service of the other, and supporting students in developing literacy and science. So those are the two readings. Neither of them is very long. And the video you'll watch for this section is called Reading a Primary Source. And I think that most of you will have set up a Teaching Channel free account, because we used a Teaching Channel video, I think, one of the other weeks, but if not, you'll need to set up a free account. It's incredibly useful to have as you're planning instruction going forward. This video shows the reading of a primary source document in a physics class, and it's a bit of a stretch for those of you who are looking at teaching young children. But I want you to look at the actions of the teacher in supporting their understanding, not focus so much on the high level of the reading itself. You could use a lot of different things in place of this primary source document. And there's no specific activity for this section. You just need to do those readings and watch the video. So the two definitions, just like our shared understanding of text, we really need to have a shared understanding of these terms and have an operational definition. So the operational definition that we're going to use for scientific literacy is the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes. It includes specific types of abilities related to doing science. So that's the what and how of science. And we often talk about having a scientifically literate population, that we should be able to read and take in information about science, and that means having some fundamental knowledge about science concepts and process. Literacy in science is the process of reading and writing to achieve scientific literacy. So our focus here is on literacy in science. We're not focused today on what scientific literacy is. We talked a lot about that in three-dimensional science. We talked about it in the process of science last week. This week we're really just talking about the process of reading and writing during science and why it's important. I want to share this definition also of reading literacy, and there are a couple times today that I'll reference some national and international tests. And this definition actually, or statement about reading literacy, comes from Smarter Balanced, which is the consortium that wrote the Common Core ELA test Montana will use. And I really like this because it could be used for science as well. And it says reading literacy is understanding, using, reflecting on, and engaging with written texts in order to achieve one's goals, to develop one's knowledge and potential, and to participate in society. So that's great because it says reading literacy, right? So that's literacy of a specific type of text, of written text. And in science literacy, as we established back in What is Text, we need to consider kind of a broader range of text because we use a lot of different things as text in science. But that literacy is still understanding, using, reflecting on, and engaging with different types of text in order to achieve one's goal, develop knowledge and potential. And so it's a pretty common literacy definition that we're able to found our discussion on for this. The two articles that you're going to read, again, I'm not going to kind of rehash the article for you, but some big ideas that I'm hoping that you'll get out of these articles. The Pearson, Moji, and Greenleaf article, I really hope that what you get out of this is some information about the language of science and concepts, various text forms, and what that means for science knowledge. And then also this idea of first and second-hand investigations. It's one thing that we design our own investigations, but sometimes we use text kind of as a second-hand investigation. And what does that mean in terms of the process of doing science? In the Krachik and Sutherland article, I'm really hoping that, again, you get a few things. One, the idea of linking ideas with prior knowledge and experiences and the role that text plays in that. And then integrating different representations and kind of having explicit instruction and modeling for those different representations that we use in science. And then asking students to articulate, to kind of apply their ideas to new contexts. We don't very often actually ask students to apply things directly to the same context that they got them from, or in the real world, that's not what we do. Sometimes we make these artificial opportunities for students to kind of write in exactly the way that they saw something. But if we really ask students to apply their ideas to new contexts, what does that mean for reading and writing? What does that mean for constructing arguments and having evidence and those kinds of things? So hopefully you'll enjoy those two reasonably short articles. And again, there's that video from the teaching channel about literacy in the science classroom. And the things that I really want you to think about as you watch are, how does the interaction with text act as part of the science learning? And again, you could use a much lower level text. You wouldn't have to use a research-based graduate level article the way that this teacher does. You could even use a video. You could use a leveled reader, any of those things. And then what instructional strategies is the teacher using to support the activity? What is that teacher doing? Because obviously the level of text is way too high for elementary that's being used in this video. But more importantly, that level of text is probably pretty high for the level of student that is there. And the teacher is doing some really intentional instructional things to allow the students to access that text. Your forum post question for this section is going to be, what will you include in your classroom to support science learning through literacy? And you're really going to need to think about those 2 articles that you've read and the things that the teacher does in the video to come up with 2 things that will be meaningful to include in your classroom. The next section is how to scientists use text. So we're now going to discuss the role of text in science more generally. Our focus is, of course, on the classroom and our students. But it's really important to understand how scientists themselves actually interact with text, both reading it and creating it as part of their work, because that helps us to better model and have more appropriate activities for our students that will help them to be prepared when they move on. So this section has no video, no activity, just an article to read called Establishing the Norms of Scientific Argumentation in Classrooms. And it's really designed for teachers to understand the norms of scientific writing. And we'll talk a lot about how that applies to students in the next section. But in this section, I want you to really think about, for a scientist, what are the norms? What does it mean to write in science? So sometimes we think of scientists as like the laboratory, the lab coat, the scientist at work. I actually have this Lego woman in my office. I like her better than the image of the mad scientist, but for a lot of people, you know, when we think about scientists, that's what we think of, the person alone in the lab doing science. In Montana, we've become pretty familiar with the image of the scientists working outdoors. Sometimes I think if we counted all the scientists in all the different fields who work outside with the land in some way in Montana, paleontologists, stream monitors, agriculture, mining, the field of outdoor science might be one of our largest sectors of the workforce. And these 2 pictures you can see are people doing stream monitoring and actually doing paleontology on Egg Mountain. If we kind of just ask people to think about scientists engaging with text, a lot of times the responses that I get are people kind of going back to that lab setting and thinking about somebody writing in their lab notebook, recording data, maybe generating a report. But this view is a really narrow view of how scientists engage with text. And in fact, it's interesting because this view best matches the way that we present the scientist in K-12 education. Go to a lab, write it up. In reality, scientists read the writing of other scientists as they prepare to do their research. They do this to understand what's been done before, to avoid mistakes, but also to generate new ideas for new investigations. They write up their findings to be published for other scientists to read. And that then allows their work to help other scientists to prepare in their own research. In an ideal world, this process would be unbounded and would really be a true collaboration among scientists. And I'd like you to think about kind of if you have a group of friends and you all read the same magazine, and your ability to kind of get together over dinner and to reference the same article, the same idea, the same current event that happened. We think about people who follow the same sports teams and are able to reference the same thing that happened during a game that may have been reported in a newspaper. Ideally, in this world of scientists, they're doing the same thing. A group of scientists who are researching a topic are all reading the same journals. So if my peer published something, because I read that journal, I now know about that. And when I publish something, my peers now know about that. And like I said, in a perfect world, that would be unbounded. Scientists would have the freedom to pursue paths that interest them. In reality, though, they're limited by grants, funding, the consumer market that keeps their company going, publishing cycles of a university. And I think it's really important to mention that because sometimes we think we can't have our students read and write the way scientists do because we have these artificial limitations. We have to meet the standards. We have these deadlines of this semester ends here, so we have to do our writing here. But realistically, scientists have those same constraints. They have to find money to research the things they want to research, and sometimes they have to research something they wouldn't pick because that's what the money was for. And they have to write on a specific schedule and deadline, much like our exam cycles are. And they use this peer review process, which you see a diagram of that on the screen, where the author writes, submits it, the editor gets peers to review it, the peers review it, say if it's good or bad. If it's good, it's accepted and published, or it's sent back for reviews, which we can use a similar process in our classrooms of allowing our peers to give us feedback before something kind of becomes final. it's kind of interesting to think about, and we're not going to talk about this in great detail right now, but the impact that social media and technology and the internet has had on this process, because scientists are now able to interact with text and be aware of the impact really quickly. They're able to talk to their peers, collaborate. 100 years ago, that would be during through letters that would take months to arrive. Now they're able to collaborate in an instantaneous method, kind of as they want to through those technology tools. Your forum post questions for this section, you have two. So the first one is going to be, what's the purpose of reading in science or using the text of others? And the other is, what's the purpose of writing in science or generating text? And in some ways, these are really simple questions, but it's an important process for you to go through of kind of defining that and writing it down, so that as you ask your students to read and write in science, you're actually able to refer back to how that plays out and how that works for scientists working in the field. Our last section is student-generated text. We're going to think about and focus here on helping students to create text that meets the criteria of scientific argumentation, that kind of meets that process of something that other people can learn from and something that allows us to learn as we create it. So you have two things to read in this section. One is they both are very kind of practical pieces. One is called Instructional Strategies to Support Students Writing Scientific Explanations, and the other is called Getting Past Just Because, Teaching Writing in Science Class. So the second one was a collaboration between ELA and science teachers in a research environment, where they really produce some meaningful tools for supporting student writing, having conferences, some things like that. And the first one, the Instructional Strategies to Support Students Writing Scientific Explanations, gives some really practical suggestions for science class, and a more simplified rubric that just looks at the scientific argument and the pieces of that. There are two videos for you to watch here. One is Exploring Light with Models and Mirrors, and this one is intended to help you think through your answer to the question about how students are using different types of text when they write. It kind of takes us back to that first section about text. And the second one is Why We Need Common Core. I choose C, and it references Common Core, obviously, and Common Core does ask for explanations and evidence in those explanations. But I would say that we could replace Common Core here to say why we need scientific argumentation, why we need to teach students to write a scientific argument, because the same thing kind of happens when we allow students to get by without ever learning that. And this is where you have the one activity for this week, and that is to go to this website called emerginginvestigators.org and explore the website, look at a few of the published articles. And what's really cool about this website is it is a peer-reviewed online journal. All of the writing is done by middle school and high school students, and the peers reviewing it are undergraduate and graduate students. And I'll talk more about what you'll do there at the end. So the first thing that we want to talk about here is actually the overlap between science and ELA. And I think that we used this this map another time, if not. This was developed by a researcher at Stanford, and what they did is they took the 8 practices from the Math Common Core, 7 statements about student behaviors in the ELA Common Core, and the 8 practices from the science framework that we talked about a couple weeks ago. And they made this Venn diagram that shows actually in the wording, which is not to imply that we don't do all of these things in all 3 subjects, but in just the wording of how we put those statements, where's the overlap. And you can see the primary overlap between all 3 is in this idea of reading, writing, and speaking, grounding in evidence, engaging in argument from evidence, constructing viable arguments. This piece about argumentation is actually the big overlap between the 3. And then if we look just at science and ELA, it's this idea of obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And in ELA, we say that that needs to be effectively in response to task and purpose, which of course in science will mean that we are communicating our information in that scientific argumentation format that you learned about in the last section. I'm going to reference NAEP again, or those kind of international tests. This quote is by one of the lead writers of the Common Core, but she's also a board member of the National Assessment Governing Board, which is the board that creates the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. What's interesting is that a lot of the Common Core authors were involved in NAEP, and so there's a huge kind of overlap. And if we look at the design of the Common Core, we can see that it mirrors very well some of the design of that assessment for ELA. But what she said is that as they reflected on the NAEP, on the difference between a proficient student and a basic student, the difference was their ability to marshal evidence to support their claims. Now, what's interesting is she's saying that just from the perspective of ELA. Now, we just talked about argumentation in science and how scientists use that, and as you read that piece on kind of understanding the discipline standards for argumentation, using evidence to support claims is a big part of that discipline standard. So it's interesting that that actually was, for the ELA Common Core, the big differentiation between a basic and proficient student on that test. So let's look at what a scientific argument is, and this is a simplified version of it, but a scientific argument is a claim, an evidence, and a rationale or reasoning. And the readings that you're doing for this section call it CER, claims, evidence, and reasoning. Rationale really matches the same thing as reasoning here. So the claim is a conjecture, conclusion, explanation, principle, or some other answer to a research question. In some cases, the claim will be the hypothesis that we talked about in the process section. The claim needs to fit with some evidence. The claim will be about the hypothesis. You're making a conjecture when you make your hypothesis, and then you test it. You're going to make a claim. My hypothesis was correct. My hypothesis wasn't correct, which is then your claim. And then you'll have it fit with this evidence, the data, findings that you've done, interpretations, whatever, and you justify that with a rationale or a reason. You have to explain, how does the evidence support the claim? Why does the evidence count as support for that claim? So this comes from another article that I didn't assign for you to read. It's called Developments in the Application of Tulim's Argument, Tapping into Argumentation, Patterns for Studying Science Discourse. So you can see it's kind of in the same line as all the other readings that you're doing. It's really somebody studying what it looks like when scientists make an argument. What is that like? What do scientists' arguments? How do they work? But I think that those of you who are looking at older grades, or if you have younger grades and you would really want to make it rigorous, these levels could help you think about evaluating student arguments. This idea that a level 1, it has an argument that's simple, a claim, a counterclaim, or a claim versus another claim, all the way up to that level 5 where argumentation displays an extended argument with more than one rebuttal. And so this idea that we kind of have to be able to go back and forth. We have to be able to say, this is what I think, and have somebody else say, I disagree, or to say, this is what I think and this is what somebody else thinks and this is why I'm right. And a lot of times in science we stay at that level 1, just a simple claim. And I'm not going to ask you to think about Tulim's larger argument pattern. I really think that the CER pattern is sufficient, especially for elementary science, but kind of looking at this idea that that as we look at more sophisticated arguments, we would be asking for that process of counterclaims. This next slide, I want to make 4 points about argumentation, besides just that this is what scientific writing looks like and therefore the type of writing that we should really be supporting in our science students. 1, argumentation is an essential element for building new knowledge and learning of science. So when we think about how scientists actually develop new knowledge within the field, argumentation is an essential element for that. So we really should be using that as a model then for our students, using it as an essential element for them to build new knowledge. The second thing is a best practice and reinforces 21st century skills, which is really great. That's why it's that centerpiece on all 3 subject areas. Another one is that evidence-based explanations facilitate the construction of conceptual knowledge. And we'll talk a lot about conceptual knowledge next week when we move into constructivism. But having students be able to not just have declarative knowledge, they didn't just memorize it. It's not just that they said, well, I did this, and so I know that this law says. Having to use an evidence-based explanation, kind of that foundation piece of scientific argumentation, using that actually forces me to have conceptual knowledge instead of just declarative knowledge. And then the last one, evidence-based explanations are a key aspect of science and should be a key component of science pedagogy. Okay, so that because it's such an important part of science, we should definitely have it as part of what we're doing in science. So you're going to read one piece that's called Writing in Science Class, Getting Past Just Because, Teaching Writing in Science Class. And what I want you to take away from this is, one, the amount of direction from the teacher that is really essential for students to be able to understand about generating text. The next, the opportunity for practice. I want you to think about how many different steps they built into the process, all of the different rubrics that they were using, all the different scaffolds. There's a table within the article that lists all of the scaffolds, and thinking about that, you know, how many different meetings they had and forms that the kids could fill out to check their understanding, check their argument. You know, what do those opportunities for practice mean in terms of students doing a good job with that writing? And then the last one, meaningful feedback. What does it mean for the teacher to give meaningful feedback? Does the rubric do that? Do the conferences do that? How do we do that with our students? And I just want to say one of my favorite things about this article, and it's something I didn't do a good job of when I was teaching. And as I read the article, I thought, oh, that would have solved that problem. And that's the question or the issue they address, where a student writes a draft and you do a conference or you share feedback with them, and when they go back to rewrite, they actually lose the best part of the draft because we get so focused on providing feedback about what needs to change that sometimes we forget to say, this section is really good, make sure you keep it. And I really like the way that in that article they address kind of how the teachers made a point of letting the student know what to keep, not just what to change. In the other piece that you are going to read, the instructional strategies to support students writing scientific explanations, there are 5 things that they say that they address as strategies that you really should think about each of them. And one is making the framework explicit, making sure students understand what claims, evidence, and reasoning are. Modeling and critiquing those explanations, making sure that you show them, I see this information, my claim is, my evidence is, and my reasoning is, make sure they see that, and then providing them that feedback through the critique process. Make sure that students understand why they need to create explanations. You know, in the Getting Past Just Because, they use a kind of cute little meatball mystery to help students understand why the claims, evidence, and reasoning is important. But making sure your students understand the rationale for why they need to create those is really important. Connecting to everyday explanations. A lot of us do a great job using claims, evidence, and reasoning in our daily life. And when we walk into a science classroom, it kind of falls apart because we get really nervous about the expectations of that classroom itself. So helping students to connect to those everyday explanations that they're making will not only improve their everyday explanations, but also relax the process of doing it in science class. And then assessing and providing feedback to students. So those 5 things, as you read that, kind of make sure that you're seeing how the authors are playing out those 5 things. This is an evaluation tool for student writing that comes out of that second article that I've asked you to read. The first article has a really big rubric. This is a very small rubric. I like this rubric because it's very simple and it's just evaluating the claim, evidence, and reasoning itself. And I showed you earlier kind of those 5 levels for argumentation, that if you were really looking at doing some higher level writing, you could incorporate those levels into this in terms of whether it addresses counterclaims and stuff like that. But for the purpose of elementary science, I feel like this is a really excellent rubric to use to get kids thinking through some of the real basics about claims, evidence, and reasoning. And this next slide, this is a again, it kind of goes back to that one where I showed you those 5 levels, and I'm trying to include some of these higher level things for those of you that are not actually looking at teaching elementary students. This is an instructional model, again, based on Tulim's work, and this ADI instructional model, if you would like to know more about this, I can send you the website, or you can just search for ADI instructional model. There's a whole website that this comes from. But I felt like this was maybe kind of a concrete list of steps of if you wanted to go into that bigger one where you're gonna give students the opportunity to know what the counterclaim would be, or to have to address kind of the other side or people who came to a different conclusion than them. You could use this kind of process where you identify the research question, you collect data, and then develop a tentative argument, and then you have a session where groups share their arguments with each other, and they take questions and hear critiques, people who had other thoughts about the argument. And in that argumentation session, then students are able to hear whether or not what they have come up with is right or wrong. Sometimes it becomes really clear as you get those questions from others that you've missed something really simple, and you need to revise your argument based on that, in which case you can go back and collect other data, develop a new argument, or you can move straight forward then into that individual writing of a report of your investigation, where you're writing your own argumentation, your own claims, evidence, and reasoning. And then this process actually goes on to have this idea of having peers review it, give feedback, and then kind of submit the report for a final evaluation to the teacher, which I feel like you could even, take, if you took out the last part of the peer review, you could even do this in an elementary classroom where you have students collect data about a real world problem investigation. You guys have come up with some great things that you might do, maybe collecting data about the weather, collecting data about animals, any of those different topics you've been thinking of, and have the groups develop an argument and share their arguments with each other, ask each other questions, and help them to really think through the other sides to some of their arguments and whether or not their evidence really supports their arguments, and focus on this part here of having students think about that before they write their report, even if you're not going to go on to the big levels of claims. Like I talked about earlier, your one activity is to go on to this Journal of Emerging Investigators, and this site is fantastic. As I said, it's all of the writing is done by middle school and high school students. So in some ways, these pieces of writing might be really great to use with younger students as kind of a challenging piece of scientific writing to read. I mean, if it's written by a middle school student, then an upper elementary student should be able to read it. But I'd like you to look at this and to really think about how does this kind of interact with your perception of the writing you were asked to do in middle school and high school, or the writing you would expect your students to do. And granted, a lot of these are polished. They've had multiple revisions. They've worked extensively with the teacher to make sure it's great. They've gone through the peer review process, maybe even made revisions after that. But they are still written by those 512, 612 students. So look at some of those and think about how that changes your expectation of what students can do. Your forum post questions for this section are, how are you going to evaluate students' use of scientific reasoning in your classroom? You've had a few examples of rubrics presented. Maybe you have a rubric that you've learned from somewhere else that you want to share, but kind of thinking about this, how are you going to evaluate that in your classroom? And then I want you to think about, how do models and diagrams function as text in student scientific explanation? That video that I asked you to watch for this section, I really want you to think about that. Those students are developing a model and then using some words with their model, especially with younger students. How does that expanded view of text really play into what their writing and their scientific explanations look like? And then the last one, how did the Emerging Investigators website impact your view of the types of writing that elementary K-8 students can engage in? And those of you that are looking at teaching high school, you can comment on it in terms of high school instead. I'm looking forward to seeing your posts for this week. I think that this section is really, really important. It definitely is my attempt at taking kind of a book that's not as new and taking the really big developments. None of this is new, but the way that we're thinking about it is essential for science education is kind of shifting over the past 10 years. And so we're using a book that was written longer than that ago. This wasn't addressed kind of this fully in that text. And so I'm really excited that we've been able to fit into our schedule this week where we think a little bit more about how reading and writing are actually one of the science processes.